that's one of you might get some new
So, yeah, I gotta record the class.
You got Skittles? Yeah. Are they sour Skittles?
Here we go. That one's here. Just one of the broken ones are this way, like that one. There we go.
I gotta do it every Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Sorry.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Man, I'm overwhelmed, man. You gotta sit that time? Which group? To the class? Let me see.
I need about 30 questions of like, what's your first sibling name? And I'm like, I don't know already. What's your mother-in-law's name? I don't have one.
Yeah, I didn't do nothing on this assignment.
I'm like, first card? Like, I started getting other names. Like, I learned to write mine.
Where'd you get this information? Because, I
All right. We missed you, Dominic.
Can somebody kill the lights?
Yep, it worked.
All right, what I thought I'd do today to start the class is go through kind of the war story of what happened back in 1997, 98, when this building was completely remodeled and expanded. And that was very similar to what you're doing now in your groups, because what I'm going to explain is how the programming pre-design worked mostly, and a little bit about how the design evolved. And it's really more of an object lesson in some ways on what not to do. I was very involved in it. I was on the committee, the building committee that represented the school, both during the programming, pre-design, and then during the design and during construction. So I was on this job for a couple of years, following it all through. And I have complete records of everything. I have a whole big box under my desk of all the meeting notes, all the files, all the things that went on. So, what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a history lesson and a little bit of cautionary tale. And also some hints that might help you in what you're doing now for the assignment. So, it involved 2 years of programming and pre-design and design. And then there was another couple of years of construction. So, and it involved a lot of different parties. Obviously, at that time, it was the Board of Regents and, the state of Florida's Department of Education hiring ed representatives, and they have their own architects and so on. And they have a selection process for picking the architects, which we had to follow. And the architects that were selected were Barnett Franzak architects here in town. And then, in this case, they also selected a construction management company out of Texas. But it all started with the faculty back in roughly 1996, sort of grumbling about how many problems we had with the building. The pigeons had invaded, and that had created a huge mess throughout the building. There were more than 24 doors leading to the outside, so there was no security. Everybody was getting ripped off because there was always one or two doors that were never locked or never closed. There was no air conditioning to speak of because it was designed to be a passively cooled building, and it absolutely didn't work because the original building assumed that we were in a dry climate and not a humid climate. So it depended on windows being open all the time, so everybody's drawings kept expanding and contracting depending on how humid it was that day. And it was extremely uncomfortable. There were other problems with not enough space. We were missing critical parts that we needed. And the building leaked continuously. It was a disaster in terms of water intrusion. So those were just a few of the issues that came up over the sort of 15 years life of the building from its origin to this point in time. Yeah.
So, so did you guys have a campus architect back then?
Yeah, but the campus architect was Bob Goodwin.
So,
And well, they don't have any say really in much in the design.
well, not the design. It's just kind of like I thought. Isn't there a process on like approving the building? I don't know.
Well,
Because I know the
the
board.
original building was done at a time when the school was really young. It was like 8 years old. And we were really trying to be state-of-the-art, cutting edge, ahead of everybody else in the country as a school of architecture. So we were innovators. We wanted a building that had never been seen before, a building that was really pushing the envelope of how to design environmentally, sustainably, and the whole concept of the school that evolved was that it was going to be a village of scholars and designers living in the forest. And these courtyards were thick with trees and benches and fountains. They were glorious, beautiful spaces where we now have these big atriums. That's why there's a monument over there. That was in the garden. That was in a nice garden. And the whole idea of the multi-story and the overlook was that it was meant to be like a village where you have shops and stores on the ground floor and people living above, and they'd be up on the balcony talking to their friends down below, and it was, a community, a communal thing. That was the concept that we were going for originally. That caused a lot of problems in the design of the building that was designed in 1978, 79, 80, and 81. And those were all the reasons we had to completely redo the building. And so we tried to do the same thing this time around. This was, version 2. This is School of Architecture building 2.0. We said, okay, how can we still be innovative? How can we still be state-of-the-art? How can we still push the envelope? How can we be still a national force in architectural education through innovation and so on? That was our point of view as a faculty. It was not the point of view of the state or the architect or the contractor. Anyway, I'll get into that a little bit. This was what the program looked like, and I'm sorry if it's kind of hard to see, I don't know why. But I can explain it. So, you have to remember, this is around 1976, probably, and at that time, technology was very different for architectural studios and things. Very few people had laptops. They had just sort of been coming into their own. Most people had to lug desktop computers to their studios. So a lot of people didn't do that. So what we decided was to have something called virtual studios. And they were meant to be a space, a support space next to your studio that had large-scale printer, color printers for drawing, scanners, projectors, the latest state-of-the-art technology that would be shared by the students in that studio. And that would mean that you wouldn't have to take everything down to some blueprint shop downtown. It was all very conveniently there. And because it's in one location, we could keep the equipment up to date. We could, replace the printers when they needed to be replaced with some new technology. That was meant to expedite your education in the studio, so it'd be more efficient. But then and the other thing was that it would have a few really powerful computers in there that could do the kind of things that students wanted to do that their minuscule computers in 1995 couldn't handle. Because you didn't have the memory, you didn't have the capacity, you didn't have the speed. So we also had something called informal pinup spaces in every studio that was designed as a jury space, not just whatever space you could find, but was designed as a proper jury space with the right lighting and the right acoustic controls and the right kind of things. And we also had something called the wet and dirty studio support space, which we ended up with. Those are the sinks in that little room that nobody goes into, but they're just going to, spray paint, graffiti, and dump stuff in. That was meant to be a very important thing because we thought you would be doing things that were kind of messy and dirty. We wanted to keep it out of the studios, and we wanted to put it into a space that had good ventilation, special ventilation for gluing and spraying and things like that. The other thing you'll notice here, there's architecture, there's landscape architecture, there's industrial design. We were actively pursuing a undergraduate program in industrial design, and I was going around the country talking to industrial design schools, finding out what they were doing, how they were doing it, what they needed, and we put together a proposal to have an industrial design. We had this vision of the school being a college of design that had all these, and we were even talking about graphic design, but of course graphic design is already over in journalism. And then we had something called the formal jury room gallery. We had 2 of those. And so this whole thing was focused around serving you guys. And we had something like 33,000 square feet of studio space and related support space for a population of 400 students. And that was, now on this chart here, it has number of workstation units, the area per workstation, the area for the room, or the space, and how many of those spaces are there. And so you can see, you can look at this online on Blackboard. It's there. You'll be able to see it better. This was sort of my analysis of what that consisted of in terms of the 400 and so on and so forth. So that was the programming process, and it was a committee of faculty, administrators, and students, programming committee. It was chaired by a faculty member, Tom Martineau. I was on it, Roy Knight was on it, a few other people. and a couple of students, graduate student, undergraduate student. And we worked for about 6 months on developing the program. And that consisted of looking at all of the issues we have with the building and trying to envision, kind of do visioning, what it could be or what it should be. And that's what we put in the program. But we were hamstrung by the state rules about how much space per student is allowed in the university's inventory of space. There was a surplus of, believe it or not, of classroom space on campus, so we couldn't program enough classroom space for what we thought we needed because the university couldn't justify it. That's why we don't have more classrooms in this building, is because of that. At that time, there was a surplus on campus. So once the architect had been selected by the normal process, there were 5 firms or something that were finalists, and they were interviewed, and then there was a form that's filled out as like and you add up the points, and whoever got the most points got the job. And Barnett Kronzak got the job. What they did was, they came up with, well, what they did was they hired another consultant, a programming consultant out of Boston. And he was with the Architects Collaborative, which is Walter Gropius's firm in Boston. And he came down, flew down here for one day, and ran a one-day design charrette. And what they did was they took the student body, and they took all the faculty and administrators, and broke us up into teams, mixed teams. There'd be 2 or 3 faculty with 4 or 5 students, with maybe the dean or the associate dean or somebody, and maybe one of the architects, firm design people. So they were all mixed up things. And we had this one day, and there was probably, 2 teams in this room, there was a couple of teams over there. They were spread out all over the building. And we all sat down with yellow trace paper and sketched like crazy and had this great time. And there were donuts and coffee. It was cool. And this consultant kind of ran the whole thing, and we had this big presentation at the end, and everybody had a representative from their group present their project, their what they came up with. This is what the architect initially came up with, and you can see the date here it's July 22nd. This is prior to that workshop. And there's some interesting things here. You'll notice they've already decided that these gardens were going to be removed and made into these atriums called exhibit space. This is the first floor. This is this floor we're on now. The library is where it is now. These are computer labs here. This is another computer lab. This is a large classroom you can divide up into 2 smaller classrooms. Industrial design was back here, where the graduate studio is now. And student lounge, the student lounge. And these were pin-up spaces and support spaces. This was the environmental technology lab, and so on. So this is where they started from. That we then, during the design workshop, kind of reworked and created. This was what they proposed for the 3rd floor. And you'll notice that the faculty offices are right in the studios. These are the upper division studios, faculty offices, upper division studios. So there would be a lot of interaction between faculty and students. And there wouldn't be student land over here and faculty land over there. And these are, of course, open to below, graduate studio in the middle, and design pin-up jury spaces all the way along the edge. Now the difference here, of course, is the stairs were moved out here, out of the way, instead of being in the middle here. They're over here. I think this has a lot of merit. This was something that we we really suggested the faculty offices should be mixed in somehow closer to where the student action is. This happened to be my sketch, which is a very rough sketch, very quickly, but the idea here was that I wanted to keep the garden here. This was a beautiful garden, and I thought we could improve it and control it, and most of the time during the year, it was useful. It was a nice place to go, maybe in a one-on-one discussion with a cup of coffee, informal meetings and things like that. So I concentrated all the development in this area here, in the north atrium, and I made this a student lounge, student-centered space with graduate studios around it, and all the computer stuff here. So this became a really active, informal, graduate, upper-level studio and lounge, and there was supposed to be a little coffee shop in here, a little cafe kind of thing. And I'm not going to go in detail over the kinds of things I came up with. These happen to be the drawings that I have. In this one, this is just the same thing, but on the second floor, this is the entry. You come in, reception, all of the administration faculty offices, the key ones are here with graduate studio where the faculty is right now, and the library in the back. And this is a big skylight going down into the student center, student lounge area down below. And this is like a gallery. When you come in to the reception area, there's a gallery of student work and things going on, so the public gets that. And this is a gallery all the way through here. So this is a big continuous gallery. And the studios with this open to the courtyard below with the bridge connecting. I'm not going to go spend too much time on these. And this is what I thought they should keep. Well, the big thing here is that move the circulation through here and put studios and things along the edge here. I had a whole other second approach, a second alternative, which is to push out to the front. And that has several advantages. One advantage is that these roof areas become roof terraces. And on the ground floor, the second floor, the entry floor, you could create a lobby, reception, gallery space, which is a two-story space. You come in, this is an outdoor exhibit space, and what you're doing is you're taking advantage of that flat roof here by creating roof terraces that open up off the studio so that you can have indoor-outdoor things going on. You can have you can hold classes out here. You can have pin-ups out here. It seemed like when the weather was nice, we should be able to take advantage of that. And these flat roof areas were not being used. And this is the same kind of thing. All of the extra square footage we needed, we could accomplish through the front here and adding a little bit in the back without taking away the garden spaces. This is one of the architect's drawings, and you'll notice, and this came after the workshops, this is the entry level, the second floor, and they had the jury pin-up spaces where the dean's office is now. Everything is pretty well the way it turned out, with studio, atrium open to below. They still have the stairs out here. And then when they came back, this was the final solution, which is what we have now. Now you'll notice, like in this is the third floor. The first year studio doesn't have these partitions. What happened there was, and I'll get into this in a minute, there was a huge budget overrun. And so euphemistically, we went through a value engineering process, which eliminated these partitions, which also eliminated all the electrical and the lighting on that, in that studio. So we ended up with a studio which was virtually useless, so we said, let's put first year in there. And you'll see this is the way it is now. The stairs have been put here and here, which violates the fire code. There's no immediate egress to the outside. I don't know how they got away with that. So what we did as a committee, and particularly Roy Knight and I did individually, and Bob Goodwin, we were kind of the three people that were key to spearheading this, is we did something called an audit of their design. And we found out, to our dismay, that we were getting about half of the studio space that we had programmed for. And so we presented this to everybody, and everyone said, well, it's too late, we already too far along. That would require too much of a major redesign. So there was an extensive amount of this kind of back and forth, where individual faculty, groups of faculty, student groups would take a look at what the architects were proposing and do an analysis and assessment of it and give feedback to the architects. And I wrote this, it says studio space shown accommodates only 226 students. The program calls for 400. The 400 spaces must be provided. And then I suggested how they could do that. So those were just, I'm not going to go over those individually, but notice things like I recommended eliminate the suspended ceilings in the studios. We were going to have ceilings like this in all the studios. Low ceilings, acoustic tile ceilings. Even the third floor. So there were a number of things like that. The student organizations got together and passed a resolution. And I thought there was going to be a riot, and I thought there were going to be a walkout protest. These were the points that you guys, as a student body, made. The innovation is not sensitive to the scale and visual character of the existing building, drastically departs from the architectural style which defined our image on the campus, and does not provide a compelling alternative. Very articulate. Connecting all the studios to multi-level atrium spaces creates acoustical problems which will inhibit student ability to work in the studios. Some mingling is desirable, but we would prefer to maintain somewhat greater level of intimacy and security. It would be helpful for the architects to observe the sizes of studio spaces which have been successfully altered to date. They're kind of pleading for the architects to learn more about what really happens in the building. Extremely large volumes of air-conditioned space created by roofing the courtyards can not be utilized for transfers without disrupting activities in the adjacent studio space and offices. Saying the way it's done, whatever's going on in the atrium is going to have some disruptive effect on the rest of the building. The proposal removes the outdoor spaces, courtyards beneath the main entry, which have traditionally been used for various school activities. We used to have a lot of like picnics and barbecues and stuff in this courtyard, and has now replaced it with a viable alternative. The layout of the administration wing is too cramped to accommodate its function. That's the dean's office and so on. The circulation problems will become particularly acute at advisement and registration time. At one time, we took all of the registration, all the advisement went through up here, and it was extremely crowded. We had to move. That's why Ron Lumpkin is not up here, he's over the other way. He should really be up here with the dean and the dean's office and all that stuff. So this is what the students, resolution they passed and presented to the architects, to the campus architect, to the building committee, and so on. This is, again, from our small committee, which Bob Goodwin, in this case it was Bill Wakey, who used to run our computer labs and did all the technical stuff. Suggestions for the architect: be sensitive to the amount of daylight in the courtyard. Studio should be located in the perimeter. Virtual studios, we were still talking about virtual studios, should be located along the perimeter and separated by low wall. Abandon the existing stairs at the elevator. Add stairs in the courtyard, and we also wanted them to replace the elevator. Nicer, bigger elevator that worked all the time. It wasn't, because that's the original elevator from 1979.
Wow.
There were a number of concerns that the faculty had about the atrium spaces, and these are things that I felt particularly strong about. I wanted this atrium space to have access by truck, so we could drive a pickup truck onto the floor, because we wanted to use it for so many different things. We wanted to build things in that space, like full-scale house, and use that as a vehicle for learning about not just construction and materials and methods, but some design lessons. And then we would ship that truck, that house, out to somebody and give it to them as like a Habitat for Humanity kind of a thing, which maybe is modular. So we do it in 2 or 3 sections, and we take it to the community. We also thought there should be an amphitheater built in, because there was a level shift. You'll notice that the north atrium is lower than the south atrium. Well, the south atrium was originally lower as well, because the garden that was out here was lower, and we could have had an atrium transition from this level down to the thing, which would have, just like we have sort of under the bridge, but this would have been the nicer one. There should be lots of floor drains. The power should be available in the center of the atrium, which we do have in the floor. The wall area should be suitable for pinups, not the brick, but pinups. Significant storage spaces are needed adjacent to the atriums for moving display walls out of the way and other kinds of things that we pull out occasionally. And the big one here, that the lighting should be flexible and available where we need it in the atriums, particularly later in the day when it gets darker and you can't see as well. So based on the above, architects should consider lowering the west end of the new extension of South Atrium to grade. This would permit vehicular access and incorporation of an amphitheater. Now, we had all these great ideas, great suggestions, things that I still think would have been better, but they were not really paid attention to. This is a sketch by Craig Huffman during the time when he was really worried about this west wall of all this glass, and are we going to be able to use that? Is that going to be a liability rather than something good? So he was looking at how do you make that and turn it around into something positive, and he thought of having these, this is really like solar filtering screen with access from down here, and these become sort of like terraces that actually would be useful, call them outdoor student terraces, where classrooms could, much like my idea of using the roof up here, things could spill out, and there would be pin-up spaces and things like that, and maybe even you could close this off with some sliding glass, or whatever. But he was trying, and again, looking at the relationship between Tinder Drive and the building, and how do we make that edge more community friendly and more interactive with the campus. This is one of the ideas that Tom Pugh and I looked at. How do we create a classroom with a sloped floor this is really 121, but 121 is now up here, and this is was the 5th-year studio. And because there's a level change from this level to this level, we thought, well, let's take advantage of that and create a slightly sloping floor here, so this can be another classroom, the size of the red classroom next door. So we have 2 of those, and you would have, you know, sight lines and so on, and we could have a projection booth in the back. So that room is pretty well just used for storage now, you know, because with landscape architecture moving out, and as you guys know, we shifted things around and people are using it. So this was just another idea that we really pushed for during the design phase. So what I'm really saying is that even though there's pre-design and we do all this great work, once design gets underway and the architect's doing their thing, and they're trying to meet their deadlines, their deliverables, they're trying to meet their cost situation, they're really not that interested in any sort of ideas coming in from outside, even if you're on the committee. They don't want to listen. This was an interesting exercise that Craig Huffman and I went through when we saw what they were doing with the big return air ducts in the atriums. They were originally going to be right here, so that if you're in the studio and you look out, you'll just see this big duct. That's all you're gonna, visually that's all that there is. So we said, well, that's kind of crazy. First of all, it's not the best location in terms of air distribution. It also blocks the view completely. It makes it kind of pointless to have this railing and looking down from 3rd floor, because when you're looking out, all you see is the duct. So we said, well, let's shift the duct here. This was the preference, to lower it so that the skylight wasn't hampered in how well it could distribute daylight down, and it wasn't creating any kind of visual problem. Or take it from this location where they were putting it, so that when you look out, you see it down here. And we even did a study of the air, how the air would move and how it would be more efficient, and a bunch of other things. But it turned out that putting it where it is now, here, was preferable to where they were insisting it should go. And we actually won that battle. Now, some people say, well, that's totally wrong with that duct there, because you've got the skylight above and so on. It was the best of bad choices, in my opinion. And you guys may still disagree. I know there are a lot of stories floating around about how that happened, that we ended up with that big duct there. So now we get into construction, and this was the construction schedule. You'll see it started in 1998. So now drawings have been signed off on, approved, ready to go, and substantial completion was August 2000. It was very complicated because they insisted we had to stay in the building. All the students had to stay in the building. We couldn't move out of the building onto a temporary location so that they could come in and just do the work without creating problems. You can imagine what it's like to be trying to run a school where large-scale construction is going on, jackhammers, dust everywhere, and renovations are messy. So what we had to do, we were forced to shift around. So they started at that end of the building, so everything had to shift to this end of the building, and then they worked in the middle, and everything had to shift, and then they worked over there, and then we had it all shift, so we were constantly moving everything. We were arguing for, let us just move out. There was an empty building on campus that would have been a big warehouse building. We could have just moved everything over there. The construction period would have been a year shorter, because all of that working around the existing operation was extending the construction process tremendously, because they couldn't get access to the whole building. They had to do it in small pieces. So we had to work out a whole strategy for how to move into some kind of interim space, what the final space was gonna be, and, that whole thing. That was a huge fight. We fought that battle for a long time and never got anywhere. This is why. Look at this, bottom line, it's a differential. The project cost status. The construction budget was roughly just under 8.5 million. Available for construction just under 7 million. Here we were 2.3 million over budget, November of '97. Here we were this is, then redesign occurred, and then, 8 days later, we were 2.7 million over budget, in a budget of only 8 million, so that's like a 25% over budget. Then there was a drastic redesign, and we went down to 500,000 over budget. And then there was an additional work done, and we were back up over 1 million over budget. And then we were at 2 million over budget. Now what that meant was, we had to cut a bunch of stuff. We cut all of the studio furniture. We cut a lot of lighting. We cut a lot of things, mainly things that affected you. We cut out a lot of equipment. We cut out anything for the shop. We cut out all that stuff. And so here's my plea. And this is way back at the beginning of this problem. You can see this is 97. Lack of adequate budget. This was looking at the way they had distributed the budget initially. Lack of an adequate budget for furniture, fixtures, equipment, normally called FF&E, for the building is a critical problem. The current level of funding, there's only enough money to provide basic furniture for office areas and nothing else. No money for equipping the studios with furniture, no money for any equipment. There's no point in going ahead with the project if it resulted in I was getting frustrated. As it appears, the additional 1.5 million requested for equipment, this was what we wanted, will most likely not be available. I strongly urge the budget to be adjusted so that there's at least 1 million in furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Didn't happen. So, just, I don't mean this to be kind of complaining. It's hard when you have this vision and you imagine how great it can be, and you've got $8.5 million to work with. You think, oh wow, this is going to be a great school. I think it turned out okay. I mean, I'm glad we have these atriums. They're very flexible. I've had to design partition systems for them. I had to design the studio furniture so that we could do them for like $200 a desk. And a bunch of other things where we had to make do, but sometimes that's okay. We had to have surplus chairs, from surplus. This is a Goodwill shopping school. And the reason we have those plastic $5 chairs from Lowe's is because we had no money for that. That was not our intent. Our intent was quite different. So when you're thinking about how you're planning this next rebirth of the school, remember that we had a certain idea about what technology was happening. We had this idea that students needed a virtual studio where they had these things. Now you can probably do much more on your cell phone and pretty soon your watch than what we could do back in 1996, 97. We were thinking about this stuff. So you have to think about, well, where is everything heading? What's gonna when this next iteration of the building is finished, it might be the year 2020. Can you imagine what the technology will be and what architecture students will be doing in 2020? The impact of I don't know, 3D printers, the impact of different kinds of laser things, the impact of robotics, the impact of how design occurs through digital modeling and digital, maybe we'll have 3D holographic models that we present in studio instead of even bothering with a laser cutter and doing, or a 3D printer to create representations. Maybe we'll really have virtual reality, like we talked about years ago, and everybody thought we would have great virtual reality by now. Maybe the whole thing about architectural education will be so focused on performance and sustainability and green architecture and those kinds of things that future architecture students will have to be much more technical, much more knowledgeable, much more able to do all kinds of different analysis and different thinking than the way we think now. And what impact does integrated team design have, which I think that could be a huge deal. Maybe it's much more interdisciplinary. Future architectural education might be, interdisciplinary team efforts. Instead of you sitting there at your laptop by yourself trying to do all this stuff, half of which you're just kind of fudging it, or because you don't really have that expertise, but it's necessary now in the design environment that we're facing. So how do you set up a process for getting there in this next round of design? This didn't do it. All of our great ideas, our great visioning initially didn't make it into the building. And it's probably a good thing because those ideas are now way out of date. In the first round, back in the 70s, we thought this building would be the MIT of the South. We would have a huge wind tunnel. That whole third floor studio and that wing was meant to be one big giant wind tunnel. And it was designed for that initially. The room next door, the archive room, was meant to be a giant artificial sky, where the whole room was this big, almost like a big planetarium kind of space. You go in there and you put your model in there, and you can program the sky to have the sun in any location. You put down and you get a really good feel for shades and shadows, and the wind tunnel was meant so that we could study the effects of hurricane force winds in Florida and the whole southern region, and also ventilation, cross ventilation, air movement in buildings. We also had a thermographic, I forget what it was called, but we had the only piece of equipment in eastern United States, or maybe the entire United States, that could take thermal readings of buildings. And we ended up lending it to MIT, and they never gave it back to us. But it was a giant piece of equipment that was $50,000 that we bought it for. And now you can do the same thing probably with your cell phone, with an app on your cell phone. I don't know. So some of those plans that involve technology turned out to be short-sighted in terms of the advancements that occur in technology. Because now you can model the air movement thing. You don't have to physically model it, you can do it digitally. You don't have to do the daylighting studies that way. You don't have to do it mechanically with this large. Although for learning purposes, it was a very good idea because you can actually see what happens if you rotate your building, how much daylight gets into the room, or you can see, a number of different, actually see it 3D, full scale, fully realized in front of you. So that's part of the challenge. You guys have any questions?
I do.
Yeah, Carl.
should we kind of just come up with a budget for private costs, like in terms of the client user saying this is the amount of money we have, for example, if we use 8.5 million as our
Well,
budget.
you know, those were dollars back in nineteen ninety-five.
Right, but I'm saying, should we come up with our own budget based upon?
That's a tough question because you don't have any realistic way of coming up with an actual budget that they go with.
In order to write our program, we don't really need a budget anyway, right?
Yeah, you don't.
Just allude to the fact that there would be a budget, would be enough. But
I don't think you should limit what you're planning for the building based upon being afraid that we can't buy it, we can't afford it. Because, you know, this is just the first step. You guys are gonna be programming the building. So you're gonna be trying to develop, you know, what activity spaces, things, how the building might function. And I think worrying about the cost at this point probably is counterproductive. But it's a good question. Yeah.
In terms of the program you have going into the industrial design,
Yeah.
you guys think it's going to try to bring it back to the school, or is it something?
No, the university was going in the opposite direction, eliminating programs. It's all about efficiency. How many students can we crank out per faculty member and per dollar? And that's why we don't have landscape architecture anymore. Because it was deemed to be inefficient. It's that kind of accountant mentality, bean counting mentality that we're living in.
it didn't help that the same year they were getting deregulated by the government. as well.
Yeah, that
I'm
didn't
sure
help
that had
either.
something to do with it.
Industrial design turned out to be a kind of a pipe dream. I put together a big proposal for it, all the different things, and it turned out we would need a lot of equipment to do it properly, because we want a prototyping lab, and that, now it's easier with 3D printers and things like that to have an industrial design program, but back then, everything had to be machined, and it had to be CNC machines, and that was a lot of money, and we had a hard time justifying it. And we couldn't prove that there was a market, that there were enough students out there in this region, particularly Florida. They're only interested in Florida because there's this idea that they're investing in students to graduate and work in Florida so they can get their investment back in tax dollars.
Why did they go with a construction company in Texas then? Why wouldn't they send their money
Because-
there?
Because they were the best in the country. It was, it was a part of CRS, actually, ironically, that were the construction managers. And they turned out to be lifesavers because they were the only people who knew how to put the whole thing together and make it work and keep it on track to some degree. There was a local contractor, general contractor, and then the construction management firm oversaw that. So it was a very complicated team, very complicated relationships, because there was our committee, then there was the campus architect, there was the architect, there was the contractor, there was the construction manager, and then there were all the engineering consultants and everybody else. So it was a complicated thing.
I still find it, well, not finding it hard, I know people, sometimes when all the politics is involved, but why, I mean, just by moving you guys out would have saved this the project in half and saved us so much money, why did
That's
you
right.
do that? Like, is it
Uh,
politics?
It was a political argument made by the university president's office. Because there had been a promise by the architect when they were hired that they could do it without having us move. We don't have to move out. So it was like a promise.
It's like holding them to
They're
it.
holding them to that promise, even though it was a stupid thing to do. I mean, because there were a couple of years when it was almost impossible in this building to function. guys are talking over groups, your groups are working, but I noticed that I put groups up on Blackboard and nobody's using them where you can have blogs and you can have wikis and you can do all kinds of things as a group, back and forth.
Do you think that instead of creating new programs within architecture, that maybe joint programs with other schools on campus would be more successful now? Kind of like
Well, we
facilities
have
management
construction
or environmental.
is now part of this school. And that's been now a couple of years. And I don't see us doing anything,
Yeah.
jointly, cooperatively, or, even though it seems very logical that particularly, like I usually have taught a design build class, and I was approaching them to say, well, let's do a collaborative design build class where construction people are part of it and we're part of it. And it hasn't happened. And you guys probably noticed that Anna's here today, and so if you're in her group, have they talked to you, have you met with them?
I just stopped running.
Okay. And you're gonna be here all day, right? Okay. Remember, you can email me or send me messages if you have questions.